Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Against All Odds. My name is Daniel Coker, your regular host. And before I introduce our guest for today, I'd just like to say that the objective of today's podcast is to give our viewers a full, deep insight on what it takes to build a company from the ground up. Right from the beginning. We're going to do a deep dive into what it takes to start a company, grow a company, market a company, and basically establish a company. And that's, like I said, that's our objective for today's podcast. Our guest today is Natalie Narh. Natalie is a co-founder and CEO of a tech company called NewComma, which is a social media platform for African and Black creatives to digitally show their work and find jobs. Prior to co-founding NewComma, she spent 5 years in the advertising industry, first at Ogilvy UK as a social content creative and chair of Ogilvy Roots, and then at social and influencer agency Billion Dollar Boy. That's an interesting name.
Yeah, very interesting.
I wonder what they do. Hopefully I'll find out in due course.
Yes,
Right, Natalie's passionate about creating content that calls for the lack of diversity in advertising and the creative industry as we know it today. She has a 2-1 degree from the University of Nottingham in International Media and Communication Studies, Culture, Film, and Media. Was it all one topic or?
Yeah, so Culture, Film and Media was the school, and then International Media and Communications was the primary course.
All right, okay. She also had her secondary education at the SOS Herman Minor International College, where she met her co-founder in Ghana and also where her parents reside. Natalie, welcome to the AAO podcast.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So Natalie, tell us a bit about your journey.
I'll definitely say, luckily, in terms of what I'm doing now and what I was doing before, is all in one stem. And I'm always thankful that I have that journey as a creative, because a lot of creatives tend to, especially in African context, tend to go down a path that everyone else wants them to go down until they then discover or embrace their creative side. But for myself, I have parents who have been supportive of my sister and I from the beginning. I always say that my sister and I are a typical African parent's nightmare, in the sense that she's a full-time artist and I work in creative tech, and those are two very those are two spaces that change all the time. So they're not as constant, but then they're also not as secure in that sense from a generic point of view. But that wasn't necessarily a deterrent for my parents to support us with like art lessons, or when I was younger, maybe about 7, I started this club called the Smart Steps Club. And I either hosted those meetings at my mom's gym or at my grandmother's hotel, my paternal grandmother's hotel. And during those club meetings, I would have maybe 10, 15 of my friends come over. I was into a lot of astrology because of my dad, so sometimes I would like share those astrology tips with them, or it would be about music, or it would be about art. We literally just come together and paint, or talk about things that we have learned over the past week between each meeting. So the very fact that I was able to start cultivating communities at such a young age, supported by my mom and like my dad's and my grandmother, was definitely impactful in terms of how I saw people in the first place, but then also the importance of creating spaces for people to be themselves and to learn at the same time. Because especially in today's scene, creatively, there are a lot of spaces that present themselves as safe spaces, but in reality, it's basically the same people who are just patting each other on the back and not really opening up the space for new people to come in and exist as they are. So I'd say the first stage of my life creatively started with the Smart Steps Club. And then from then on, it was just exploring like different things. My dad had a brief phase where he was into photography.
Okay.
That was maybe around 2006, 2007. And as he was teaching himself, he was teaching me as well. I was just tagging along to all his photography trips. And I think that started forming the main foundation of everything else that I did creatively after then. Because naturally, when I was editing photos, I'd get into graphic design and then eventually video editing as well, which I started doing in high school. So in SOS, that's where I met Nigel, my co-founder. I joined at the IG stage, and then Nigel joined in sixth form for IB. And we had both done this course at the London School of Photography. It's only a 4-day course. He did his 2012, I did mine 2013. But because we had that common understanding of the intensity of the course and how practical it was in terms of being involved, but then also having the opportunity to stretch that content for an entire semester in our high school, because we're leading the photography and video cast clubs. And that gave us the opportunity to extend what we had learned from that course to other people. But I think the main thing to take from that was we realized that not everyone, even in London, can afford a £500 4-day course for photography. And we started discussions in that high school in SOS. It was about 2013 now, about accessibility and expanding on skill sets based on what is available to you where you are. And in London, there are several alternatives to that £500 course that someone here who's upcoming would still have access to, compared to those who might be living and working locally on the continent, where that benefit of choice just doesn't exist. So that laid the foundation in terms of us figuring out how do we start like leveling the playing field for those on the continent compared to those in the diaspora, because the special thing about SOS was we had people from all over the continent there. So we weren't just learning about the Pan-African theory, we're living that reality within that boarding school. So naturally, every time we thought of issues, it wasn't just in the context of Ghanaians, it was in the context of Africans. And when we moved here to the UK for uni, we felt a natural detachment to that creative scene. And we started working on creative projects just to still have that link back home. So around 2017, we started this documentary called The Cool Kids Project. And all that did was highlight alternative upcoming creatives and entrepreneurs in general in Accra. So we did one edition that featured this rap group called the Mem Gang, Bishop, who is now a renowned private chef, Benoit, who runs Hamatan Rain, one of the biggest curators of Africa's neo sound today, and Denzel, who is also a socialite, so he curates a lot of events in Accra, and some others as well. And within that, it was important for us to highlight that although these people are just starting out in their careers, they're still worth highlighting. So the creative direction behind that project was mocking them up on popular publications like Forbes, Complex, etc., just to show that they don't look out of place in these spaces, and we should be able to give them their flowers before they hit that international stage. Because one thing on the continent is people are able to recognize talent, but then they don't take it seriously until they've reached that international stage. And although on one side is great because for them to have gotten there means they're doing something right, but then on the other side, we shouldn't have to wait for Western validation to be able to recognize our own abilities and our own impact and our own potential. So we did 2.5 editions of that. I say 1.5 because we did a follow-up edition to show where our first cohort were 1.5 years after we had shot the initial content. So where our primary pain point for NewComma came in was we wanted to do a 3rd edition across the continent, which meant we had to similarly find upcoming talent in Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, etc. And because we lived in Ghana or had lived in Ghana all our lives, it was easy to identify upcoming talent because we're in that scene. But if I'm trying to do the same for other African regions, it felt next to impossible, because as much as all of these people exist on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever, because it's not built primarily for Africans, trying to find those who are at the very
beginning of their
beginning of their journeys. If you don't exist in those physical spaces, it just isn't going to happen as organically in terms of finding them. So we're like, okay, instead of trying to action this, let's just start building a platform that curates and gathers all of these creatives. So that's when we actively started building NewComma in 2020, January of 2020. Yeah. So that's, I was going to say the shortest way, but that's a very long way of getting there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for the benefit of our viewers, when you say creative, I mean, not everybody understands creative.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us a bit more about who are creative people?
Yeah. So I'll start with the fact that everyone is creative or can be creative, and that's a positive and negative in the sense that because everyone can be creative, it can be difficult to professionally set those lines, because someone can wake up and start calling themselves a doctor or a lawyer because there's a very distinctive path to getting to that specific position. Whereas with being a creative, because it can be self-taught, a lot of people adopt the fake it till you make it approach, which works for some. And I actually encourage that for a lot of people because it has a low barrier to entry compared to other industries. But it introduces a lot of subjectivity, it introduces a lot of gray areas that I appreciate makes it a bit difficult for creatives themselves to define themselves, because in trying to find opportunities in everything, people need to know what they're looking for. And a lot of creatives don't necessarily have that in hand. But for me, anyone who is creative is someone who can translate a personal thought to something that feels unique and presents that to other people through any medium. And that can be through art, through music, through writing. There's various like sectors that sits within creativity. But for me, it's primarily about the ability to transform your thoughts into something tangible for someone else to consume.
Okay, so I guess that fits us within that category then, because because this is a podcast that I came up with by accident in Portugal earlier on this year. And I'm not a media person. I work in the city. I've always worked in the city. I'm a chartered management accountant. I wouldn't have considered myself a creative person. But then having started this, I realized that with every guest, I've got to do research. I've got to think of different ways of presenting things. So I guess probably that means that I have a creative side to me.
100%.
So for the purposes of our viewers, who might be, because a lot of people have dreams of one day owning their own businesses, or I mean, you're specifically in the media tech space. But then for anyone looking to start a business, or anyone who's ever harbored the thought of starting a business or going on an entrepreneurial journey, there are certain foundational principles that they need to go through. And I mean, the first one that I think you've identified is that you've got to find a problem to solve. Okay, and you said that you noticed that there wasn't inclusion, for creatives in a certain space, and a lot of the platforms that existed were not created or designed for people of color, people in the African continent, and all that. So you set about finding a solution to that problem. Okay, so how important do you think it is for people to crystallize exactly the problem that the business or service or enterprise that they're setting up seeks to solve?
Yeah, I think even from a foundational level, you can't solve a problem that you can't identify. So even when people are unwell, you can't really take an action until there's a concrete diagnosis. And I think it's the same kind of logic here, where I think a lot of people struggle with identifying exactly the problem that they're trying to solve. It's very easy to come up with the solution of the idea, but in terms of what that's being paired to from a problematic point of view, I think that's where people tend to find the most trouble, because even Nigel and ourselves, as much as our primary pain point, which was providing opportunities to Africans and increasing that visibility for them was the basis of our problem. There were so many other layers under that we had to identify, like being able to pay Africans from, like, if I'm hiring a freelancer in Nigeria, like, paying them is very difficult right now because transferring pounds to a Naira account feels next to impossible sometimes. And although there's so many like solutions that like tap to that pain point, it can still be a struggle. So it's identifying stuff like that, identifying stuff like racial discrimination here in the diaspora, and looking more at other levels of discrimination in the continent that might be more pervasive, like sexism. And it's also looking at defining who your audiences are first and working backwards from that. Because, for instance, with us, although we're targeting Africans globally, of course, there's so many other pockets that sit under that. The kind of issues I would face here as a creative in London is completely different to how someone in Burundi would be facing issues within a creative context. And for us, it was so important for us to draw the line within those nuances from the very beginning, just so people are able to know exactly who we are talking to, but then also contextualize the problem as well. One quick example of that is literally up until a couple of months ago, we always described NewComma's target audience as African creatives locally and across the diaspora, as opposed to African and Black creatives. And the reason why we initially did that was because if we had primarily and initially described it as a platform for Black creatives, people would have thought of African Americans, Black British people here across the diaspora before they think of people living and working locally on the continent. And as much as all of these parties are still very important to NewComma, we also realize that when people think or address Black people, Africans on the continent typically get put on the back burner. So we decided to start with defining them as a primary target audience first, and then bring in everyone else who typically has an easier route into defining certain spaces for them. So that's the strategy we had behind defining what that target audience was. But yeah, defining the problem, figuring out the solution. But then I think another thing to say here is also figuring out if you are the person who should be solving the problem. Because everyone thinks if I'm able to identify the problem, then I should be the one starting the business. And I think especially for people who are my age, so like younger millennials, it's more so people have gotten into the culture of being a business owner or having like a side hustle and a main job. And I think there's so many other factors that have contributed to that, like the economic situation now is completely different than it was like 20-30 years ago, where you could have one stream of income and be able to live a life with that income, whereas now it's demanding several streams of income to have the same standards of living that you would have had a couple of decades ago. So I do understand that side of things, but on the other side, once you identify the problem, it'll be clearer in terms of if you can still solve that problem within a 9-to-5, or you can solve that problem with partnering with someone else, or you have to solve the problem by establishing a business yourself. And I think once you have that honest answer, then so many other things will become. I think honesty, self-honesty has been especially important to me, because creatives tend to do a lot of things at once. So for me, for instance, I do graphic design, photography, videography, and a bunch of other stuff. And I try to do everything at once all the time. And it just wasn't working out because I liked or enjoyed doing certain things, but I wasn't as amazing at them as I wanted to be. So I had to be more honest with my introspection and know when to park certain things as always, and the other things that I can monetize as well. So
so you basically touched a very important point, which I was going to come to next actually. That you've got to identify your suitability, for whatever venture you're going into. And something I learned quite early on in my career was that everybody's got a different template. Some people are very technical. People like your dad, they're into computers and stuff like that, just really, really technical. They just get it. Some people are sort of more creative. They think of things. They're always dreaming things. You know, the problem with creative people sometimes is that before they've established anything, they move on to the next thing, and they move on to the next thing, they move on to the next thing, they move on to the next thing. So they never really concretize anything because they're constantly into thinking of new things. Their heads are always in the clouds, you know. And you've also got people who are good at supporting.
Yes.
You know, so you've got to decide, okay, maybe I don't need to be the face of this thing. I need to be in the background supporting. You know, and you also have people who connect, who kind of make things happen. You know, people who will sell their idea to the market and are very good at presenting and communicating and stuff like that. And you've also got people who are also very good at systemizing. You know, they can build systems to kind of make things work. And the point I'm trying to get to is that once you've identified the problem and you've found the solution to the problem, and then you've assessed your suitability to solve that problem, you might find that you need to bring someone else in to complement what you're doing. I mean, for instance, with this venture, I tend to be the face of it. You know, I have a co-founder that I started this project with, and by nature, I'm very, I'll say very driven. You know, I kind of like to get things done. I like to move at 180 miles per hour. It's like, why don't we get this thing done? Why don't we I don't know, go. Yeah. But my partner, he's complete opposite. He's very chilled out. You know, he takes his time. He will analyze things, and that's good because we kind of balance each other. So how important do you think it is for people to take the time to carefully select the people that they're going to partner with, either in a side hustle or if the side hustle grows into a proper commercial venture like yours? How important do you think it is for people to make sure that they have complementary personalities within their team to drive things forward?
I think first of all, you're definitely right in saying this is the perfect segue, because in knowing yourself, or in having that layer of introspection, you can identify the gaps that you have, and it will become clearer in terms of the kind of person that you need to partner with. And like yourself, Nigel, my co-founder, he's also more laid back. He's more numbers focused. He works in banking. I don't like numbers. So in terms of NewComma, he handles more like operations, and I handle more marketing. And we've got a tech co-founder as well, Barima. And I think between the three of us, we all met each other at different times. And like I mentioned before, Nigel and I met in high school, and the benefit of that was he lived the specific experience that I did, that NewComma was born from. And I feel SOS especially has a very unique experience that everyone might not understand. So some of the insights that I might be speaking from would be very difficult to explain to someone who didn't live that 4-year bubble. And the benefit of that is we have a common reference point. But then in terms of finding a co-founder in general, I think it's finding someone that you like as a person primarily, because usually the reasons why certain businesses dissolve, or like certain co-founders like part ways, isn't because the business itself isn't working. It's because the people dynamic between them just isn't working. And once you have a good foundation of yourselves as people, even when you come across challenges, it'll be easier to navigate through, because you have that personal dynamic that complements each other quite well. So that's one thing I'll definitely say. Like them as a person. don't just make certain decisions like hiring a co-founder from a well-known entity and stuff like that, because especially in tech, a lot of people tend to say that those who work at the larger companies and then move to startups might not be as helpful, because in larger entities, of course, there's so many other people to fall back on. There's so many processes that already sit in place that you might not even have to consider or think about, because it's being done in the background. But in a startup, you have to do every single thing.
Everything.
Yourself.
Sales, marketing, you got to pick up the phone, you're a receptionist.
Exactly. It's
you're the PA, you're everything.
It's very hands-on. And for someone who's had the benefit of working at all of these like bigger tech companies, there are some things that you wouldn't even think to have to bother with, and for some people it tends to make them a bit more laid back than they should be, because it's like, I didn't have to do this before, so why should I do this now? I'm not in the right pace of things. So that's definitely one thing I would say on people who find or align with people just because of the names of the businesses that they've worked with, because at the end of the day, it's all about the person and what they can offer, and not the contributions of literally thousands of people to a business. So that's one thing. The second thing as well is being realistic with what both of you are bringing to the table. Once again, if it's very similar, it's not necessarily a bad thing that it's very similar, but you don't want too many of the same kind of people in one space, especially in a startup, because if you need to diversify resources on a smaller team, then if you have people who can do the same thing, you're not necessarily maximizing efficiency, because you can't really have that full breadth of action points. So that's also another thing I would say. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just one thing to think about maybe more than once. And then maybe the third thing I would say in relation to that is also looking to the future of the business, actually thinking about what your exit strategies look like, because that's where people might clash as well. A lot of people ask us if we're building NewComma to sell. Thankfully, Nigel and I have a similar philosophy on that, and it depends on who's buying and why, but we're not necessarily building to sell. And the reason for that is, it goes back to the same problem. There are already so many social media platforms that exist, that exist for African creatives or for creatives in general, but because they don't have that sole focus on Black or African people, they will never really approach the pain points with the same kind of passion that we will. So if we got acquired by one of these entities, or like another entity who kind of lives in the space, we kind of go back to square one, because ownership is especially important in this case, because it's all about developing organizations and entities and ecosystems that primarily accommodate African people. So if we get acquired by someone who doesn't necessarily have that primary philosophy, it will then end up having to compromise on certain things that we wanted to move away from the beginning. So that's why for us, I think we have that additional layer of who's buying and why they're buying, of course, how much. So there's all of those layers to consider, and I think in finding a co-founder, those integral aspects of the business, you should at least have those foundations set in place to avoid any kind of tensions in the future. But of course, you can't have all of those questions answered from the very beginning, but at least having the basis. I think having the basis in any kind of relationship in terms of morals and values definitely helps when things get unpredictable and more challenging.
Okay. So in line with that statement you just made on values and all that, how important is it in establishing a business to think about your brand? Because brand values are associated with brands. I mean, if you look at Disney are very family oriented, and they wouldn't make a movie of where they'll be killing and stuff like that because it's family oriented. That's the brand. And so for somebody watching who's thinking of setting up a company, how important is this to take time and to invest in creating a brand that is in synergy with the values or the people who are executing whatever solution that this business seeks to provide?
I'll definitely say there's something to consider in what actually makes up the components of said brand, because especially now in the social media age, you have instances where your personal brand is intrinsically linked to your business brand. So if you're an influencer, for instance, and you start, I don't know, maybe a fashion line or a jewelry line, whatever line, and people are initially buying the products because you're supporting you, you need to make a decision on if you want that brand to continue to be set on your personal brand, or you want to start developing new ways of communicating your brand that doesn't have to do with you. Because if something happens to you, or you suddenly have a lot of negative press that you can't exactly dissolve or anything like that, the business directly suffers as a result. So it's just about making those like initial like discussions. Once again, do you want your face to be attached to the brand and stuff like that, and that defines so many layers of the strategy. But then once again, in terms of like values of the brand, sometimes it's working backwards from the pain point and then attaching that to your target audience. Because one challenge that we have, especially at NewComma, is because we're so privy to the nuances of our audience, sometimes it makes marketing challenging because you have to adapt the same story for different people. The way I would explain NewComma to a white middle class man who has worked in advertising for 10-15 years is completely different to the way I would describe NewComma to a 19-year-old black person in uni. So it's just being realistic with the diversity of your audience, but then trying to find a neutral space that sits for them. So I'll use our visual branding for NewComma as an example. We've kept it very generic for a reason, and that reason is there's no one way to represent Africa, there's no one way to represent black people. And I think what a lot of African or black brands tend to do is try and follow one particular aesthetic for these groups, and although on one side it feels relatable, it's recognizable, it's doable, on the other side it doesn't feel as distinctive, but it also feels prescriptive in the sense that people always expect a particular backdrop in African context, and it in some ways it also furthers the Western perceptions of Africa, because if you're looking at global distribution, African channels don't necessarily have the same leverage as Western channels. So if you're looking at what has been most popular up until maybe this last decade, it's been primarily Western channels who have been globally defining who or what Africa is. And for us, it's also looking at what some of these relationships between the diaspora and those on the continent look like now, but then also how to level the playing field for both of these groups via branding and communications. Because for instance, Ghana had the Year of Return initiative launch in 2019. And although that's come with a lot of traffic to Ghana locally, it's also come with a lot of opportunities for those in the diaspora. And sometimes you have stories and opportunities being told by those in the diaspora. And although of course everyone is Ghanaian, the kind of insights that someone who's living and working in Ghana right now would have is completely different from someone who, like myself, I always say I haven't adulted in Ghana because I moved here when I was 18. And things that the typical adult would be going through, I went through here in London. And if I'm crafting a story based on an adult in Ghana, someone who's living in Ghana, who probably I would hope, would have more insights on that than I would. But it's not to say that those in the diaspora shouldn't get those opportunities. It's about always ensuring that everyone who has the most relevant context to whatever's being documented is in the room, or is at least addressed at some point during the process. And for us, what that means is Nigel and I are literally the only ones in our team who live in London. Everyone else is in Ghana and Nigeria. And the reason why it was important for us to work with people on the continent, it's so people who are solving the problem are people who are experiencing the problem. And that trickles down into how we develop our brand strategies as well.
That's great. So following on from that as well, one thing that you've kind of highlighted on is the fact that you need to develop knowledge about whatever it is that you're doing. You have to learn different things, and you mentioned that in a startup you've got to be flexible because you're going to be wearing many hats, up until the time that you might be able to hire other people to do various bits and pieces. And you've also mentioned that you've got to know your audience. I mean, for instance, like I said, we started this podcast, I'm not a trained media person, but then I'm suddenly having to look at subscribers. I'm trying to look at content. I'm trying to look at how to make the content relatable and for people to want to click on thumbnails and various things. I've had to learn so much, and I was talking to my kids last night and trying to understand the demographics of younger people and the fact that younger people wouldn't watch an hour-long podcast. So you've got to chop it up into little bits and stories and stuff like that. How important do you think it is for people to invest in acquiring the knowledge that they need to make their entrepreneurial venture a success?
I think in any capacity, one would have to be very intentional about how they share the content that they're creating. And actually, on this point, I'll go on a quick tangent. I think a lot of artists, especially, are becoming content creators instead of just existing as artists. And what I mean by that is, if you look at Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, but primarily Instagram and TikTok, a lot of people's social media patterns are determined by the algorithms and how often they share content, what kind of content they post, who they collaborate with to share these posts and everything. And on one hand, obviously the algorithm is helpful because it helps suggest the right content to people. But then on the other side of that, it means if I'm an artist and I'm not necessarily ready to create again, because I know I have to stay consistent on my Instagram, TikTok, wherever, I would end up posting anyway. It might not be my best work, it might not be work that I'm passionate about, but it's work that has to be put out. And that's when they start going down the content creator tangent in terms of like churning out something every day, every month, however often it is. But being an artist is more when I'm ready, when I'm done, when I want to show people that this is what I'm going through, this is what I've experienced, especially since so many creative expressions are so defined by personal experiences that you can't rush certain things, which is why I always find it funny when people bully musicians to release music, because for some people it's so personal to them that if they feel they don't have anything in their life worth documenting, then they wouldn't drop any projects. But then sometimes some artists get pushed into releasing subsequent projects sooner than they might have wished, and the project isn't as great because it's not being stemmed from a personal point of place. So it's definitely a bit of that as well. And that's why with NewComma, we're trying to adopt more of a LinkedIn approach where of course, LinkedIn still has algorithms and everything, but it's not as aggressive as these other platforms. So what that means is you're posting your best work, you're posting your work when you need to post it. Your work isn't being judged by how many followers you have. I think that's especially important to us, because you can have 2 million followers and someone with 200 followers might be better for the job in this particular context. And for us, it's also about trying to extend equal opportunities to people based on what they bring to the table, and not just on cosigns from other people. And obviously cosigns are important regardless, because the more you have, the more use cases you can reference and all of that. So it's definitely still important, but I wouldn't say it should be the primary thing for making a decision. But yeah, I think in terms of content creation in general, I think it's more so just, once again, I think it's the same principles, learning about your audiences, learning about what they want, but then also aligning that with what makes the most sense for you and what feels the most sustainable to you. Because with TikTok, for instance, I feel it's working now, but for the future, it might not be, it might be sustainable from a business point of view, but in terms of the impact on people's lives, maybe not so much, because if people are living lives dedicated to churning content over and over and over again, it can get very mentally exhausting. There's quite a few influencers who have struggled mentally because they always have to be on social media. They can't even take a break from social media because they're toying with their revenue. So it's definitely there's definitely lots of layers within that, but yeah, I think that's definitely something to consider.
Okay. And then again, the other issue is, I mean, you've touched on this already, that with creatives, sometimes they go through a phase where all the creative juices are working, and they can come out with all kinds of things, and then they go for prolonged periods. Actually, quite a number of creative people that I know have suffered from mental illness and depression and all that, obviously feel by the pressure to appear to be working.
Yes.
And sometimes a creative person just needs time to be.
Yes.
And not to be seen to do anything, just to be. But in the context of a working environment, it's like just being doesn't fit.
Yes, and it doesn't feel efficient. It doesn't feel profitable either. And for me, especially when I worked in advertising before, I always just allowed myself to literally do that, just exist for the day. And my best ideas always came when I was maybe, I don't know, watching a show or scrolling on the timeline and stuff like that. And I do appreciate that I can afford to have that just exist approach because it's advertising and it needs to come from a sense of place. But I'd say one challenge of the creative industry is because we're not robotic in terms of our output, but the way industries are set up in general does adopt a robotic fashion is we tend to suffer because we're trying to limit ourselves to these boxes that everyone else has to be put in, and as a result we might not always have the best work, or we might have work that has already been done, or we might have work that does the job, wins the awards, all of that, but it's not actually solving the issues. There's so many advertising campaigns that just exist for the prettiness of them and not necessarily for the so-called pain points that they're supposed to address. So yeah, it definitely has a knock-on effect in terms of how people approach the work that they create, but then also how they're compensated for said work that they create.
How important would you say it is for anyone watching this podcast to find out exactly what their client wants and then come up with a solution that meets that need, rather than giving people something that they personally think or they personally enjoy and they think that other people need? I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think detachment was very important for me from the beginning, and also being open-minded was also another thing, and also just being realistic, because although Nigel and I experienced our pain points firsthand, it doesn't necessarily mean that people will experience the same pain point in the same way. So actually most of 2020 was us doing market research from the creative point of view, interviewing creators from all over the continent. We did like 200-300 people for most of 2020, and it helped because lockdown, so everyone actually had the time to talk and stuff. But what we then discovered was the differences in the pain points in different regions, what people cared about the most, what they cared about the least, what they were looking for the most as a creative. And for us, we were able to compare that to what we had already documented and see, okay, based on this feature has to go live first. And that actually informed our decision to go live with the project builder, which gives creatives the opportunity to share their work, because we realized that the pain point for businesses is actually having that pool of creatives. But if we don't have a big pool of creatives, there's no value for our clients. So, which kind of worked out for us, because building the actual job boards feature has taken a lot of time and energy. But in that time that we've been building the job boards feature, we've been building our creative communities, and it's been done in such an organic manner that once we're now ready to onboard businesses, we actually have a proper value proposition for them. And I would say the other thing on detachment, for me, as much as NewComma exists as a social media platform, NewComma doesn't have to be a social media platform to address our problem, because there's other layers to consider, like being privy to the digital divide on the continent. Like not everyone has constant access to internet, not everyone has constant access to a smartphone, for instance. We run a monthly micro grant on NewComma where we award £100 to an African or a Black creative, and our project builder is only available on PC, on desktops, but people only have mobiles, so that means they can't use a project builder. So sometimes they reach out like, oh, I haven't got a PC or a desktop. I'm using a mobile. How do I apply? But they can post their work to the feed. So we say, post to the feed and use your feed link instead. Mm-hmm. But then what if I don't have a phone? I don't have a desktop either. Mm-hmm. What do I do then? So we've been looking at other solutions that use like USSD, for instance. This is a lot later down the line. How do we then partner with telecommunications companies to make job searching easier for someone who literally just has a phone that isn't necessarily a smartphone? How does someone find jobs that way? Mm-hmm. How do we partner with high schools and schools to know that to open the minds of kids younger, because a lot of people end up avoiding the creative industry by accident because they don't even know the opportunities that are there. I remember I started freelancing as a graphic designer. I used to do all the copy for my work, and then I joined an agency. And within a week, I learned that, there's a copywriter. I don't have to write my own copy. Okay. So someone else can do this. So it's just by being in another environment that I discovered that I don't have to be doing everything. And it's the same way someone who is exposed to the creative industry in high school might be privy to opportunities that they can have later on in life. And the thing with detachment, is NewComma can exist as an events curation company. It can exist as an advertising agency. It can exist as a thread of workshops. It can exist as so many things that can sit offline, not necessarily online. So the social media platform is a channel, it's a vehicle, but it's not the idea. It's not the primary solution. And I think it's also for our audiences to determine what's the most important thing for them. And what that means is they are able to communicate that for us and we move accordingly, as opposed to us making assumptions. Assumptions aren't always right. So that means we might be making certain business decisions that wouldn't make sense because it's being made based on what we want and not what they want, but they are the people using the platform. So and it's also just being realistic about situations, because once you discover that people's needs aren't necessarily in line with what you thought the needs were, it takes that detachment to be able to pivot to address those external needs. So I've just been trying to have as much of a realistic detachment as possible to what NewComma exists as. And also it's more fun that way for me, because I like a lot of things, and I like taking umbrella approaches to my ventures, because that means I can do anything under this umbrella. As far as it sits there, then I'm fine. And that's how I see the mechanism of NewComma going forward, existing as anything within the creative industry, but the basis of it is leveling the playing field for African creatives all over the world via a variety of channels that can exist at any point.
It sounds like the work that you're doing, especially for freelancers, is likely to be of a more of a temporary nature, in terms of people get hired for a project, and then they have to go for the next project. I might be wrong, I'm not sure. But then, again, going back to the theme of today's podcast, which is like how to build a company from the ground up, or how to start something and grow it. How important do you think it is for people to overcome the fear of failure, the fear of, because it's something that we all go through. Like I said, we started this podcast by accident, and there was a fear that nobody would watch it, and nobody would subscribe, that it would be a total failure, that we wouldn't get, because again, we come out every week, right? And you've got to find a guest every week. I remember a few weeks ago, we had somebody cancel, and we did a shoot for someone and they didn't quite like it. So it just completely messed up our scheduling. Yeah. And I was just basically looking everywhere just to fill these slots. Yeah. And for someone out there, who's probably watching this, they might not even be aware of what it takes behind the scenes
to get things
across the line. They might not have any idea the pressure, the pain, the sleepless nights, the rejection, you reach people and then they don't come back to you, blah, blah, blah. What are your experiences, and how can somebody watching this podcast learn to overcome those initial fears of starting something and even failing? And they talk about failing forward.
Yeah, I think it's definitely failing forward, and also learning the power of surrendering. Because like even to the previous point of detachment, it's not even necessarily from a point of things being temporary. It's just being realistic with the fact that the way that we have envisioned NewComma might be different from how people actually use the product. So we have the event ticketing feature coming up towards the end of the year as well. People might end up using the event ticketing feature more than the jobs board feature. So what that might mean for us is we might start dedicating more resources to event ticketing over job boards and stuff like that. So once again, it could have been a situation where we might have been so bent on things existing just at the jobs board that we would have been pushing our personal incentives behind the pressure to dedicate more resources to jobs when event ticketing is clearly more profitable. So it's also just assessing things objectively and just moving with that. But I will say that for me, it's also been a thing of accepting the fact that there are certain things I've had to sacrifice to get NewComma to where it is now, or to keep things sustainable. Because I've only been working full-time on NewComma for a month and a half, and before then I was working on NewComma and my full-time job. And obviously what that came with was the lack of time. So it's essentially living two lives in one, and you miss out on social things, like certain relationships suffer, certain, like your mental suffers as well, because you're like constantly going all the time. And as much as there are some things that I think I maybe shouldn't have done in terms of overworking and like realizing just how much the ease of working is now because I have time, I don't necessarily regret making those sacrifices, because I wouldn't have been able to achieve certain objectives without that. So like with everything else, everything in moderation. But I will say that as far as you're already working within a specific space, you should be ready to make certain sacrifices. It's not literally we were interviewing someone in Nairobi, and we're asking them what's one thing you want to tell creatives. His name is Kevin. He runs this streetwear brand in Nairobi, and he said it's not as easy as it looks, but it's also not as hard as it looks. And I love that he said that, because the easy part comes from the passion, comes from the willpower, comes from the want to do something, but then the hard part comes from the reality of actually executing things. So it doesn't always feel doable, but because it feels easy to you because you want to do it, it makes those hard pills to swallow just things that you have to do, and not necessarily things that would or should break you. But it's also just being in a space of knowing when to say I'm quitting this. I think quitting is a powerful tool in itself, because sometimes quitting means that you've discovered that I want to do something else which will be better. Quitting means that I'm literally in an environment that isn't conducive for me and my well-being, so I shouldn't be doing this. But quitting can also mean just having another field of exploration for yourself. You don't always have to monetize everything that you're good at. You don't always have to be in a space where you're only doing things for external validation. How much does external validation impact your day-to-day? And if it does, if you're an influencer, for instance, how can that change to match a life that you want to live for yourself in a way that still pays your bills? So yeah, quitting can mean a lot of things, but then also that there's also quitting in the typically assumed context of you can do it, but you're quitting because you feel like it's too hard, but it's not hard enough for you to jump ship. But laziness might come to play, fear might come to play. There's so many things that might come to play that might make people quit before they should. So I will definitely say that there are instances of quitting that shouldn't be there, but generally, I would definitely say at least once you know that there's a rationale behind your quitting that leads on to something else, it definitely isn't a negative in my context. There's always a learning. There's always a stepping stone to something else within that.
Yeah, and just as we prepare to round up, how important would you say it is for somebody looking to go on an entrepreneurial journey to look at the data? Once you've started, look at your data and analyze the data and break it down and do a deep dive and take decisions based on that data instead of being blinded by this passion of trying to change the world and do this and do that, and the data or the indicative data doesn't support that enthusiastic vision. And you might need to recalibrate and re-strategize. What can you tell us about that?
I remember sharing one of the first drafts of our pitch deck with my dad, and he said it was too romantic. Because we focused because it's born from such a personal experience and insight. We focused a lot on what the wider mission was, what the personal sentiment within our target audience was, and everything. But you can't argue with numbers, and for an investor, the numbers are the most important things. It would be problematic if they focus on anything else. So him saying that it was very romantic made us take a step back and go more into our objective data, because we had data, it just wasn't leading the conversation. And of course, the context matters. If we're speaking directly to our creators on social media, numbers isn't necessarily something that they would care about as much, but to an investor it does. And especially in an African context, we struggle with data because on a larger scale, there aren't as many reports that touch African context or African creative context. I think we have two of the most scanty data sets in terms of that crossover. So it can make certain things challenging because you know certain things to be true, but you can't necessarily objectively say so with numbers, data. So but I will say that especially in 2021 and 2022, our focus was curating experiences and activations that could provide us with that objective data to pitch to investors. 2020, we hadn't even told anyone publicly that we were building NewComma. That was primarily market research, just ideating, iterating, and stuff like that. We announced NewComma publicly December 14th of 2020. 2021 was building that initial creative audience, getting the beta site out, getting initial user feedback, using that to iterate. 2022, we did a few more activations in terms of events, learning more about the audiences physically, because physical experiences gave us so many more insights that we didn't necessarily consider as much when we're doing a lot of online activations. And then towards the end of 2022 to 2023, it's been building on those activations and properly documenting the returns of those activations, just so we could have a proper case to pitch with. And I think if anyone is seeking external investments in a business, whether it's via a VC firm like a venture capitalist firm, or angel funding, or using any kind of bank loan, or even family and friends, in all of these contexts, the data sets are completely different in terms of what you focus on the most. Like a family or friend might not care as much about the return compared to if you're securing VC funding, or if you're applying for a grant, for instance. Once again, the use cases are different. I think regardless, you need to show the profitability of the business and everything, but I think dependent on who is giving you the money, the objectivity of that data becomes more and more critical, dependent on who you're pitching to.
Okay. And the final question for today is, how important is it for entrepreneurs to validate their concept? Because you have an idea, you've seen a problem, you've come up with a solution you think is suited to provide the solution, but then you haven't tested the concept. And then you quit your job, and, you print a business card, and you're going to rent an office space, but your concept isn't validated. How important do you think? I mean, you just said you've just started as CEO of NewComma full-time recently, and I presume that over the past 3 years, you've more or less been testing the concept and fine-tuning it and putting it through different iterations. Yeah. How important do you think it is for people to validate their concept?
I think everything generally sounds nice in theory. so it's also just assessing the various contexts that your idea sits in and how that can exist over time. Because an idea that would have been born out of the experiences of lockdown during the pandemic would perform completely differently in today's climate, because that was a very temporary situation, and all those certain products like Clubhouse, for instance. During lockdown, Clubhouse made so much sense because everyone was online. You could go on Clubhouse, listen to so many spaces and stuff like that. They were almost acquired by Twitter. They denied. Then Twitter built Twitter Spaces, and then they still exist, but they're not as widespread as they were during lockdown.
Okay.
And I think that came with a lot of gray areas in terms of how the product would translate over time when people started going out more often and stuff like that. And so that's just one quick example of maybe not assessing as many tangents as one could have at the peak of things, but it's also just acknowledging the fact that not everyone lives the same life as you, and in some cases you might find that you might be addressing a niche market, but is this a niche market that has a big pocket, for instance? Okay. So you can still keep your business afloat that way, okay. Or is it an accessibly affordable product or service that millions of people need, okay. Right? So there's two touch points, and establishing that also even determines how you market those products to certain people, because more high-end products for smaller audiences of people wouldn't necessarily be sitting in a newspaper ad, right, or something. So it's also just looking at how all of that ties in together. And like you mentioned, I was basically working in NewComma 3 years before I went full-time. And that indication of going full-time was, one, having the external funding from our pre-seed. Yeah. And that made things realistic, because up until that point, Nigel and myself, or at least for us, at least for me, the only reason why I was still working full-time and working in NewComma was because I was using my salary to pay our team's salaries as well. It's the same mechanism for Nigel. Yeah. And for us, we knew that that turning or like pivotal point would have been having that external investment where we could sustain people's salaries with that investment, as we also had salaries from that same investment as well. And there's less of a need to be working externally for someone else when the funding is coming from another source. So that's one tangent. But then also the other side of it was the experience of working in agencies gave me the knowledge of certain processes and certain principles that also further validated the idea, in the sense that working in an agency made me familiar with the producer, knowing that they needed a freelancer every few weeks for a project. Okay. Or 2 to 3 people in a team might quit, and we need to fill in those those full-time roles within a set amount of time. So all of those, like, presumably small situations were all insights for what we're building with NewComma. Yeah. Okay. So all of that was also like validating the idea. Okay. So yeah, that's one thing I'd round up with. Like, I think I mentioned this point before, not everyone has to be a business owner, but then the other side of that is not everyone has to be working on their business full-time immediately. Because one, still having your 9 to 5 gives you space to learn, gives you an income, but then the other side of that is if you're working in the same space as what you eventually want to do full-time, every day at work is an opportunity to gain insights, to make connections as well. For me, that made such a massive difference in terms of working between Ogilvy and Belinda Labo in terms of getting industry connections, knowing how to leverage those connections respectfully as well, and just moving within a tangent that always made the most sense for me. So I'll definitely say with any business venture that anyone has, just being realistic with who you are as a person, and then knowing how that translates into the business, but then also knowing how other people are responding to what you're giving out, and knowing how to iterate based on that feedback.
Okay. What about scalability?
Scalability, I think it's also knowing when to scale, because especially in the tech space, you can fall as quickly as you rose. And for me, I'm always of the philosophy that building great things take time, but also being realistic to some of the unfair advantages that certain businesses have, but then also knowing when you have an unfair advantage and knowing how to use that as the basis for scaling. So for us, what that looks like is, once again, looking at how job boards and events perform. We would then know how to scale, because we might be scaling the wrong aspect of the business. We might be investing resources in job boards when we should be investing in events. But then it's also looking at your audiences and their needs and touch points and scaling based on that. And what does scaling mean for you? Scaling could mean scaling your team internally. It could mean raising some more investments to build on the existing features that you have within a tech context, or it could mean you're creating better quality marketing strategies, videos, pop-ups, events, etc. So scalability could look different for different departments of the business, but the objective should always be primary to what your most important pain point is, I would say.
Okay. What do you think of this podcast as we round up?
Yeah, I think it's definitely what I like about this podcast is it focuses on the roots of these business owners and how their personal tangents inform the growth of said businesses. Because I think in a lot of ways people tend to assume that businesses are rigid or robotic in the sense that it should always come from a very mechanical point of place, but then we don't realize just how much people's personal experiences inform the kind of decisions that they make, and even how they cultivate the cultures within their businesses. And company culture makes such a big difference to how well they're performing. So yeah, I think this podcast does a really great job of gathering those insights from several people across different sectors.
We also have a tradition on this podcast of asking our guests to dedicate an episode that they feature on to anyone of their choice. So if you're more than happy to look into the camera and dedicate this to anyone that you want to.
So I think I have a 1.5 dedication. I say 1.5 because I feel like it has to be my dad by default. But I also wanted to dedicate this episode to Yinka. And Yinka is, I'll go on a quick tangent. Yinka is someone who offered help with NewComma and actually helped. I think that there's a lot of people who just say, oh, I'm going to help you with something, and then they don't really help, or they help you on their terms. But Yinka has been very useful in terms of providing us with connections, providing us with resources, helping us review our pitch decks and stuff like that. And yeah, I think he's generally been quite instrumental in our journey at NewComma. So my dad by default, and then Yinka.
Okay. Well, Natalie, thank you very much for coming on this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
And at this time, I'd like you to do a couple of things for me. If you've liked this episode, I'll be most grateful if you could leave some comments in the comment section below. This is absolutely critical. I keep getting comments on my WhatsApp messages. This is great please leave it in the comment section below, as well as send it to me on WhatsApp. Secondly, I'd like you to like the video because we're trying to grow a platform here, and your liking of it takes us a very long way. I'd also like you to share this video, because it takes a lot to put this content together, and there's somebody out there who's going to watch this, learn something from it, and basically change the outcomes of their life. And then finally, I'd like you to subscribe to this channel. We're trying to come out on other platforms as well, Spotify, Podbean, and other platforms, but this is a primary platform for now. So please do us a favor, subscribe. And I want to say thank you to the 500 plus people who have already subscribed. Like I said, it doesn't seem like a big number, but we're grateful because it validates what we're doing. And we are learning, we're trying to improve, so watch this space. And then also finally, before we go, I'd like to say a very big thank you to my North American friends who sponsored us and helped us along the way. Opoku and Leah Champong, Michael Addison, and Lekete Dapilma, all from the US. So thank you very much for your help and your support. And also Emmanuel Achampong, my neighbor in Harpenden. So thank you very much for your support. There are others who've helped us, and in future episodes, I will acknowledge you accordingly. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Natalie, thank you very much.
Thanks as well.
And see you next week.